add, in addition to Dick's introduction this afternoon, I am also a Scrum Master, so a certified Scrum Master. I would challenge that it's not quite as cumbersome to go through and get an Agile Scrum Master certification, but I guess that's the nature of Agile versus ITIL, which was a grueling 2-day written exam to get service manager and then eventually the expert designation. My ITIL expertise and understanding does certainly go farther back than my work with Agile, but I've found it interesting to see the two practices not as competing frameworks, but as really a combined set of good practices that we can use both in our organization and with our customers to help them improve the service that they're providing ultimately to their customers. So to talk a little bit about ITIL history. Now, I wasn't in IT when ITIL was first developed. It does go back now more than 30 years. And originally, I won't get into too much detail, but it has evolved over the years. It was originally very siloed and function-based. It then evolved in version 2 to more process-based. There are two very good books, Service Support and Service Delivery, that I think still have a lot of valid and useful information for today's IT organizations. I think especially in the US, we still have a lot to learn about some of the ITIL best practices and standards. In 2007, and then again with an update in 2011, was the release of ITIL v3, and they continue to update this framework even today. It does build on the work that was done previously, and it's interesting to understand that now this is a life cycle-based practice, and that it starts in the middle here with service strategy. We develop our strategy, we hand that off with our requirements to design. During the design phase, logically, we develop a particular service. We then come up with a design package that gets handed off to service transition. Service transition then has some of the processes that we're familiar with, such as change management and configuration management, with change management really being the central process of that phase. From change management into release management, we then get a release package that gets handed off to production and our operational or live environment. So we're then into service operations. And out of service operations, that's where the end user sees the value of the support that IT is providing to them. So incident management, problem management, and so on are some of the processes that we study in that particular phase. From service operation, the output there is reporting. And reporting is passed on to this concept of continual service improvement. So just as Dick was talking about continuous quality improvement and the need to be agile and more responsive to our customers, ITIL does have some of those same concepts as well. And I'll point to where some of the concepts overlap between the two practices, and also how Agile especially can help us in the implementation of the ITIL framework and good practices for the organizations that we support. So I did touch on a few of the processes that are covered in the ITIL framework. This is a very ambitious project to define all of the processes and phases of the service lifecycle that for the services that IT provides to the organization. And the criticism has been that some of these processes are cumbersome to the IT organization and don't really allow us to be as competitive as we may need to be, especially if you look at a service or a process such as change management. There are a lot of approvals, a lot of documentation that's required. You've got to go before a change advisory board. And for that reason, developers especially have really tried to bypass or ignore a lot of the lessons that are taught in the ITIL framework. What we find, though, and what our experience has been, is that we don't necessarily have to choose one or the other, Agile or ITIL. We can certainly take the good from both of the frameworks and use both to help us develop a better practice and better support. Now, in contrast to the ITIL process areas, the Agile practice, or the framework itself, is very straightforward. It focuses on the customer and on rapidly developing software. There are a number of different methods that we use to implement Agile. So we have, some of you may be familiar with Kanban boards. Scrum, I mentioned I'm a certified Scrum Master. That is a particular methodology where you follow sprints, and I'll talk about those two in a little bit more detail here in a moment. There are several other methods. In contrast to ITIL, which is somewhat rigid, it is licensed. It is you do have to pay a lot of money if you want to purchase the books. Agile, on the other hand, is an open methodology, and therefore there are a number of different ways or a number of different methods that you can use to employ Agile. So here's an example of Scrum. So in the Scrum lifecycle, we do still have some upfront planning and discovery. So it would include the system architecture review, making sure that we have the correct platform. We want to make sure that our project team has the appropriate skills. And then we go into a series of development sprints. So we're working with this backlog of user stories. So depending on your familiarity with Agile, these may be some familiar terms to you, but user stories are essentially our requirements. We have a list of requirements. Ideally, they are prioritized, and the job of the Scrum Master is to make sure that his or her team is working on the highest level priority user stories or solutions first, and also making sure that they have enough work to do during each of the 2 sprints so that they can get through the initial planning, development, review, and then retrospective. And there doesn't have to be testing. Dick was just talking about, as opposed to waterfall, Agile does expect there to be continuous testing. There doesn't have to be testing after each sprint, but when there is a release, certainly there should be testing. The expectation is that the review and retrospective will give the development team also some opportunity for making sure that, at least from a functional basis, that their code is working properly. Again, the goal here is to make sure that we are able to respond to the needs of the business on a more frequent basis. So as the marketplace changes, IT should be in tune with what the needs of the business are, really using IT as a competitive advantage. So if you think of the waterfall method, and this goes not just for projects for the business, but also for IT. Sometimes we approach, for example, a BMC remedy project, and we start up front with all these requirements for incident, problem, change, configuration management, and then so many months later we end up with the final product. And a lot may have changed during those months for the IT organization. And the requirements that we started off with may not be the same at the end. So we find it much easier to conduct these projects in a more iterative manner. So we'll take it into smaller chunks where we'll focus, okay, first we're going to focus on incident management. And maybe it's just a portion of incident management, and we'll take 2 weeks or maybe a month at most, work with that set of requirements. And at the end, ideally, we'll have a functioning product. It may be just a component of the larger ultimate deliverable, but it should be a functioning product. In the same way, this is an actual example from Atlassian's Jira product. A Kanban board can allow us to do the same thing, to manage our work in progress, or WIP. So if you've ever heard the term WIP, it's talking about work in progress. So we have this board, and you can even start something like this with technology as basic as sticky notes. So each box on this page represents a user story or a requirement. And we put these requirements up on the board, and as they move from on our to-do or backlog, they go then to being developed or in progress. We have ultimately a code review and then done. And each item then moves from left to right. And it allows us to do several things. It allows us to capture the work as it's coming in, be much more responsive to the requirements, and also identify where there may be bottlenecks. So maybe we need to increase the size of our development team if there's too much that's in progress. Maybe we need to increase the size or provide additional automation for testing if there's too much in code review. So I mentioned that the Agile framework, unlike ITIL, is open source. And as opposed to the 5 large books that you have in ITIL, Agile Principles and the Agile Manifesto are fully written out in these next 2 slides that I will show you. So here we have 12 Agile Principles, and I've made one change as we talk about an Agile approach to implementing ITIL and the ITIL framework and ITIL processes. I would argue that in addition to being applicable to software, that we can also apply the Agile methodology to our ITIL processes. So we want to have continuous delivery of our processes that are delivered frequently, and we may not have an unlimited number of processes like we might have unlimited versions of software, but certainly the expectation is that we will be continually improving the processes and the services that we're providing to our customers. You could even argue that you could substitute the word services here in addition to the word software and processes. I'm not going to read all of these, but if you do Google Agile Principles, you should find this list of 12 principles. As I mentioned, it is open source. The manifesto, I've even included the URL here where you can see this in its entirety. The Agile Manifesto talks about the goals or what's important for Agile, individuals and interactions, working software. And again, here I would challenge that you could substitute the word processes or services for software. And I think there's still some pushback in the industry. A lot of times there's a big focus on documents, and we want to see the documentation. And I understand the importance of documentation, obviously, especially as a consulting firm. We want to be sure that we're providing a system that's going to be easily maintained going forward. So we want our customers to understand how to use and maintain the systems that we put in place. But we really do focus on the working processes and the working software as our deliverable. I will also highlight this last point, responding to change, and this whole concept of continuous development. Again, another big parallel to the work that I do in the ITIL framework. We have this concept of continual service improvement, and I'll go back to that here in a moment. Within the ITIL framework, the 5th phase is CSI, or continual service improvement. The way that we improve our services is making sure, first of all, that we can measure our processes and the service that we're providing. So we start with planning. So this is the Deming Cycle. You may have seen this in other scenarios. It was originally developed for manufacturing, but it applies to a lot of different services and products that people produce. So we start with planning. We make plans, we then implement them. That's the do part of the Deming cycle. We then check to see how we're doing. That's where the reporting comes in. So that's why it's so important that we can measure and report on the work that we're doing, because the next step after that is taking corrective action. If we see, for example, that our mean time to restore service to our customers in incident management is higher than we would expect, say that it's over 10 minutes, and we know that 10 minutes in the life of our business is worth a certain number of dollars, then we can adjust based on that. Take corrective action and do the appropriate training or hiring that we need in order to improve that particular process. This is the basis of the CSI model that's part of the ITIL framework. So this is the CSI model. And you'll notice this last one, it starts with what is the vision in service strategy. And as it goes around, the last one here is how do we keep the momentum going? I would say that that's important for us as consultants when we're working with the customer. We know that the longer something takes, the more opportunity we have for changing requirements. So we want to keep the momentum going. We want to be responsive and be able to deliver solutions that are still relevant to our customers. And as you're approaching implementing ITIL or implementing any of the ITIL processes or Agile methodologies, especially when we look at the ITIL framework, a lot of times we'll be asked, what do you recommend in terms of implementation order? In most business, and certainly in Agile, a big focus is on the quick win. How do we show value to our customer? The important part of keeping that momentum going is to maintain our customers' faith in us, and we do that by providing quick wins. So I would say that for most organizations that are providing IT service, so whether it's you call yourself a help desk or a service desk, whatever that front customer-facing group is within your IT organization, I would say one of the quick wins and one of the most visible wins in the organization can be incident management. After that, it really depends. There's sometimes that whole focus on incident problem change, configuration management. Those I would say would be the top 4 that we work with. But again, it really is dependent on the organization and what your specific requirements are. And I would say that, in focusing on the customer, I was working with a customer this week, and I repeated one of the mantras that I've had over the years in talking with customers. RightStar also does, in addition to IT service management consulting and process consulting, we also do simulations for DevOps and ITIL. And I always try to drive home how important it is in IT, not just make sure that you're speaking the same language with others in IT. So understand, for example, what's the difference between an incident and an event and a problem. But you also want to be speaking with your customer and speaking to them in terms that they can understand. Really have a sharp focus on your customer and your customer's needs. I think in IT, a lot of times we're afraid to talk to the business, but I think if we improve that communication that we have with them, then we may find that they're not so scary after all. And that if we can provide value to them and show the value that we're providing, make sure that we almost market, use marketing as a tool to kind of sell ourselves to the business, it really can go a long way to improving that relationship. We want to be sure that we're able to adapt. Again, going back to the communication, listening, measuring our progress, maintaining that pace, simplifying, allowing teams to self-organize, and also allowing teams time to reflect and adjust. So in the simulation exercise that I just mentioned, one part of that simulation exercise is to conduct 3 rounds. So we have 3 rounds. You have an opportunity in between rounds to reflect on what was successful, what was not, and make the appropriate adjustments. And likewise, when we're implementing a new service or a new process or improvements to an existing process within our organization, it is important to have that time to reflect and make the appropriate adjustments or take corrective action. So some of the key points, and I'll emphasize again communication here, not just within IT, but with our customers and also with external suppliers. Quick and early wins would be the other point that I would emphasize on this page. Keeping all of that in mind, and with the topics that we've talked about this afternoon, I hope that people recognize that it's not Agile versus ITIL. It's not choosing DevOps or ITIL. Both methodologies are based on this concept of the Deming Cycle, plan, do, check, act, making sure that we're continually improving the quality of support and service that we're providing. An Agile approach is ideal for the adoption of the ITIL IT Service Management Framework. The pace is not slowing in IT, and we have to be able to provide new services, new processes, and improvements to our customers on an ongoing basis. And finally, Agile can help to simplify the processes themselves, especially for processes that are thought to be cumbersome, like change and release management, which increases the adoption within IT and also ultimately leads to higher levels of customer satisfaction. So that's what I was hoping to talk to you all about this afternoon. I hope it has been useful for you. And if there are any questions, Valerie or Dick, did we have questions that came in?
Well, Valerie, or, excuse me, Nikki, great job. Now would be a good time to submit a question. One question that was previously submitted was, and you touched on it a little bit, but the person was asking about different training options on both the ITIL and Agile side. Is there anything that you would recommend? I know you talked about some simulation training.
Sure, and I would, in looking at the RightStar's website, Valerie's done a great job of including a lot of the solutions that we provide or products that we provide. So in addition to just some basic white papers that we have on our website, we do offer a number of different types of training. So there's anything from a half-day simulation exercise where you can really engage a large number of people within your organization to go through. There's the Apollo 13 simulation for IT service management and DevOps. There's also a different DevOps simulation that we run that's more, it's based on a retail environment. In addition to the half-day exercises, we also do provide longer training and have resources for DevOps as well as ITIL through some of the partners with whom we work.
Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit about DevOps or Agile versus ITIL. And there was a Gartner paper that came out that talked a little bit about DevOps being the bimodal bridge to mode 2. And you had to really figure out, well, what is it exactly that the Gartner's talking about? And I think the gist of that was that DevOps is sort of the mode 2 and it's focused on agility, while ITIL mode 1 is sort of focused on stability. So so you're following what I'm saying? Do you think that in a number of years there's going to be really kind of a shift away from, not necessarily away from ITIL, but to more of an agile ITIL emphasis then. Is that what that's all about?
Yeah, and I've seen a reference to, I can't take credit for this, this was some reading I did. I've seen a reference to Agile service management, which I thought was an interesting concept. And yes, it is. It really is taking that fifth phase of the life cycle, the continual service improvement, and applying that to all areas of IT support and delivery. So whether it be from incident management or the financial management, all aspects, we're going to have to continue to keep up with the needs of the business and the pace that's continuing to increase.
Right, and even at the Pink Elephant Conference, and Pink, by the way, is this ITIL conference that's done. It's been done here, I think, every year for about the past 22 years, something like that. So they're responsible for all this ITIL training. But ITIL really had the whole point of that opening keynote this year was, ITIL really has to remain relevant. And does ITIL matter? Well, of course it does, right? And the way to make it relevant is to have more of an agile approach, and they sort of coined a new word similar to what you were just talking about, and they called it integrated service management. So that thing, so I don't know, maybe they were thinking that they could come up with some new training classes or something, that they get a certification in integrated service management. So
yeah, I think the things that ITIL teaches us, in the way that we provide support, I mean, that's not going away. We can't stop supporting our customers, but certainly the way that we do it is going to change, and that's going to that's constant.
Well, sort of, on the same line of conversation, change management is often viewed, if you're on the ITIL side, as something that can be a little bit overly complicated, right? So that, in other words, it could take you longer to get all the approvals and fill out all the, you wouldn't really be paperwork anymore, but typically you'd have a tool that you would have to go through and fill out a number of different screens to get the approval for a particular change. And it might take you longer to do that than it would to actually do the change itself. So I've heard that as a criticism of ITIL, and whereas what are some things that in order to make ITIL more agile, what are some things you could do then on the change side to speed up that process?
Yeah, I think change is probably one of the processes that's really, it's really lends itself well to improvement because of the cumbersome nature. So there's a lot of different things we can do. We can push down approvals to what we call local levels of authority. We can streamline the input process for change requests. We can also, as we're using methodologies like Scrum, for example, it's expected that as the development cycles are going through, as we're going through these sprints, that there are going to be certain changes within that controlled environment that are pre-approved, meaning that the developers have the approval to go through, and as long as they're doing the appropriate levels of review and testing, that they can continually implement these things without having to go before the change advisory board, for example. Also using Kanban as a way to manage requests for change.
Okay. All right. Well, that is all the questions that I see. So I don't have anything else. I certainly